Hello and welcome. My name is Stephanie. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to welcome you all here, and especially to welcome you, Victoria. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. It's early in the day here in Denver, where I'm chatting you from. So across the world, that's the magic of the virtual events, right?
Yeah, completely different to here, where it's almost 8:15 and being blinded by the sunshine. I guess this event is just to basically catch up with you to talk about your writing process and how you got started. So you did a whole podcast Instagram. Well, it originally was on Instagram, wasn't it?
The No Right Way podcast.
Yes.
Yeah. It was an Instagram live that I did early on in the pandemic, because I realized that as authors, most of the time, the only way we get to see each other in our communities is at festivals and at events, and realizing I wasn't going to have any of those, I miss my friends. And so I started reaching out to a lot of my writer friends, but specifically ones who wrote different kinds of work, to kind of pick their brain over how they create. Because I think there's this myth, well, it's a myth we're constantly trying to dispel, that there is any right way to write. People constantly write to me asking, like, what's the trick? What's the secret? What's the formula? And there's no formula. And some of my best friends and some incredibly popular authors have such different processes to me that it was fun to shame them for a while, to just antagonize them and be like, how can you possibly do that?
Everyone's just got such a different way of doing it. It was really interesting to listen to, because I listened to it after the fact. But I guess you started with asking them how they got started in publishing, and so how did you turn the question back on yourself?
I got started quite young. So I started in poetry, actually. I wrote poetry all through my teen years. I won a few contests. I got like my ego up a bit about it. And I got to college and I realized I wanted to make a profession of writing. I actually went to college for astrophysics, so that was an unpleasant conversation with my family. But I wanted to write, and I think being quite the analytical person that I am, I knew I probably wouldn't make a career in poetry. So I turned my attention to fiction and thought, can I take everything that I love and have learned about poetic cadence and syllabolic rhythm and meter, and can I infuse that into my prose to make my prose stand out in some way? And so I sat down to write my first book when I was 19, and just to prove that I could, right? And it was terrible. I finished it, which is like the main threshold you have to cross. So I want to say that, like, anyone who's watching this, just finish it, because you can always make it better. But it was genuinely terrible. But because I had a very strange style of writing, or a unique style of writing because of the poetic meter of it, it got a lot of agent attention. And so I was actually signed with my first agent when I was 19.
That's really good. And
that book went on submission for a straight year. It got to acquisitions 4 times, like all the way to the buying threshold at publisher. And that was the point that every publisher seemed to realize this book has no plot. So it never sold. And I went back to school and I did my thing. And I realized as a senior, so 2 years later, 21, that I have to try again or I'm not going to do it. Like, I'm going to blink and I'm going to be 40 and I'm going to, like most of my friends, there's a reason I'm about a decade younger than a lot of my colleagues, is because like they went off and they had a life and they came back to their passion. And I knew that if I didn't sit down and write another book, I was going to do just that. So I sat down, I carved out 2 hours a night. I walked to a coffee shop right next to campus and I wrote, and I treated it like a job, and it was brutal. But when I graduated, I had a new novel. Yeah. And that one went on submission right after I graduated, and that would become The Near Witch, which was my very first novel. So I've been in publishing since I was 21.
That's quite a young age.
Now I'm an old hag.
No, you're not. But you can, I think now you've said that, you can definitely tell the kind of like poetry elements in your writing. It definitely still comes through. But another thing is you've always been quite like open about like your writing process, and like you're very open about talking about it. Was that always a plan, or is that something that you've just like come into contact with being exposed to publishing for so long?
No, I honestly think it had to do with my age, because when I came in, I was so young and the industry was so opaque at the time. Like nobody talked about the hard parts. And so you would go online and you would just see authors just talking, just celebrating, which is wonderful. We should celebrate our successes. But when you're having personal shortcomings or personal failures or personal difficulties, and you look online and all you see is other people succeeding, you begin to think it's you. You begin to think, well, they must not be having any hardships. And then I went to a writer's retreat. So I'm suddenly in person with 24 other authors, and all they did was talk about things that were going wrong. And I thought, I've been so lonely, thinking it's just me. Publishing really tries to make you feel like an island in that way. And I was really frustrated that these other authors, and it wasn't their fault. It was the industry was perpetuating this concept that we only talk about the good things. And I was like, I don't need to hear about the good things. Like, I need to hear that you're struggling as well, so that it doesn't feel like it's just me. And so I decided really early on that I can't control how my career goes. I can't control how popular I am, but I can control the kind of narrative and transparency that I engage in. And so I try very hard to celebrate all of my successes, but also to talk about the difficulties of being a creative professionally, the mental health side of it, the career health side of it, and just try and make people feel a little bit less alone. Because whether you're on your 21st book, which my 21st book comes out in March, whether you're on your 21st book or your first book, we go through the exact same struggles when we sit down. It's not like when it's just us and the page or us and the screen. It really doesn't matter how far along you are. We all struggle.
Yeah, it's always been like, I personally like really refreshing to see somebody just talk so openly about it, especially like online, because now you can see so much of somebody else's life. It's always been like really nice to see it. Do you think it helps you keep like almost like grounded in your writing, so it's like almost a little bit of a reality check?
I think part of it is that it keeps me grounded, and part of it's a lot more selfish than that. I think that when readers see what goes into the work, they appreciate it more. And I think, and sorry that I have a hair. I think when readers see the struggle and the behind the scenes of it, it just makes them appreciate the finished product. And so I totally admit some of it is selfish, of me wanting to be humanized, because I think there's a tendency, especially as you get more popular, as your profile rises, to dehumanize the creator. And I want my audience, my people that I engage with online, to remember that, like, for better or worse, like, it's just me trying to tell a story. There's no like grand machine. I'm not, it's very much not like the movies. It's just, I feel very alone a lot of the time, and having that sense of community, and it's not unique to me. I think it's just a lonely profession. And so I think having a sense of community and having readers who really appreciate what goes into it, they get to celebrate with you. They take a pride in your success because they know they were there for it, and they know they had a hand in your success, both by buying the book, but also by supporting you, sending you messages when you're struggling, things like that.
Yeah. Because one of the books that obviously you've been really open about, like, writing for or having on the back burner for years is Addie LaRue.
Yeah.
How has it been with it being like kind of out there, not on?
It was a huge relief, because I held that story in my own head for so long, and it was really like I was the only caretaker of it. And with a book that big and that daunting and that long in terms of its history with me, I did feel an immense relief when I could hand it over to readers and say, okay, this has been a really big weight. Now you guys keep it up. Because like, then for them, it's like, for every one of the readers, it's just a pebble. For me, it was the whole world. So I just feel like getting to disperse the weight in that way. I mean, I also won't lie, like, I felt a huge amount of grief when it was done, because I had lived with it for so long, and I had lived with Addie as this passenger in my life for so long, that setting down that weight, while it was a relief, was also a sadness.
Yeah. But I really liked having someone talk about how that it took you so long to feel ready to write that book, because I feel like quite a lot of people just come out with books like year after year, and it feels like they never stop, or they never sit with it for long enough.
Well, and so people, this is the dichotomy a little bit of my career, is that I'm a very prolific writer. Yes. But everything that comes out has been sitting for years. And so I have like kind of an overlapping system where it seems like I'm putting out a book every year, but I'm not thinking up, writing, revising, and releasing each of those books in a year. So like Addie, came out a year and a half after Vengeful, but like Vengeful was 3 years in the work. Addie was 10 years in the work. My next book, Gallant, was 5 years in the work. So it can seem like I have it set up that way on purpose, but
Yeah.
everything is sitting for much, much longer than I'm writing it. So I just always make sure I have the 6-burner stove metaphor that I always say I have, like my brain is a 6-burner stove and there's all these pots on it. But I have never had a book that came into my head and I wrote in the same year. Most of the time it's like several years worth of steeping. So then by the time I sit down to write a book, first of all, I know how it ends. I know like the shape of it. I just haven't put pen to paper on it yet for the execution, but I know all of its pieces because I'm sitting with it purposefully for, like, I'm working on Threads of Power now, which is the next book in the Shades of Magic series. And I've been sitting with it for 4 years. So even though it will probably take me 9 months to draft, that's not the same as like, I never think of, I'm not a fast thinker. I'm a fast typer. And even still, I never write more than 2,000 words a day, ever. It would never occur to me. Just because I tap out, my quality goes down. My brain doesn't like it. I'm very much like I always say like a relentless creative, like a systematic creative. Like I like to get something down every single day. I spend time with my work every single day, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm pouring out 10,000 words.
That makes sense. So like, is there a point, or is it, I suppose it's different with every book, where you do, how do you know when you feel ready to write it, I guess?
I mean, that's the $1 million question. It's completely like a pulse check. Like I check in with my work when I'm not writing it yet, every 3 to 6 months, and almost like stir the pot and ask myself, like, is it ready? Do I have everything? So Gallant is a really great example. Gallant's my next book, and it's basically like Secret Garden meets Crimson Peak, but I sold it. And then I decided I didn't want to write the version that I had sold. It was much more like a fairy tale. And then I sat with it for like a year and I was like, that's not right. And then I started thinking about like underworld tales and like death and like decay and the porousness of these things that I explore in most of my books. And then I started thinking about the Upside Down from Stranger Things. And I just started like playing, but it would take another 2 years. And I would go back to this project because it was very due. Like my editors were like, hello, would you like to turn in Gallant now? And I would be like, yeah, sure, I'm working on it. And I hadn't started writing it because I wasn't ready. And then, I mean, poor my agents and my publicist and my editors, like I would sit there and I would recraft the entire thing, stress test it, put it back, let it sit, try and come together. And there's just a certain point where you realize it's never going to be right. It's never going to be the right time to write, but you run out of excuses not to. Like you hit a point where you're like, I can't actually make it any better, or I can't shore up these weaknesses until I have something on paper. So for me, there are certain things that I need. I need the ending, not just an ending. Like 20 books in, my endings have never changed. I have rewritten the books completely from scratch in revision, but the endings haven't changed. So the ending for me is kind of like the thing I'm working toward. And then pieces of a character arc, probably 5 to 6 pieces of the plot, and knowing that I have enough material so that I'm not writing thin. And then at that point, you're just like, it's on the calendar and the deadlines kick in and you say like, okay, I will turn in Gallant in 6 months. And then you really don't have any, like I do that so that I don't have the excuse anymore. So it's kind of a combination. I wish there was like a temperature check where you could just say like, oh, it's 100 degrees. Now we go. But it's just a testing. I mean, for Addie, it took 7 years.
Yeah.
Much to my chagrin.
But it was worth the wait. I'll say that. I really enjoyed it. So so like you said that you always know your endings first, but one of the things I really like about your books is like your characters. So how set are the characters when you start writing, and do they like progress as you go, or are you the kind of person that has to know like every single detail, like what their favorite food is and that kind of thing?
So I think those are small details. I don't need to know the minutia. I need to know the like macro side of the characters, because if I can understand the characters in a big way, then as I come to need their details, the details will be there. I don't feel like it helps me to like know their Myers-Briggs type going in. What I need to know is what they fear, what they want, and what they're willing to do to get it. And as long as I know those 3 things, I can start to figure out like the shape of their personality and their identity and their stress points. So really the little tiny details, like what they say or how, you know, like what color they would choose. I don't need to know that. Like that will tell itself if I've done the rest of the character work right. And some of it's discovery. Like when I sat down to write Addie, Henry, and Luke all did 180s. They were all completely different. When I started to figure out Addie, I thought she had this existential ennui because she'd been alive for 300 years. I thought she was going to be tired. But then I realized that she has, you know, her hand over the exit button. She can get out of her curse. All she has to do is say the word. So I couldn't actually design her to be that tired because she would have pieced out. So instead I had to 180 her and make her this relentless optimist. The same with Luke. He started out, like the devil started out as this kind of amorphous, very inhuman character. And then as I started to look at him and analyze him, I was like, no, like it's 180. Like he's a petulant child. He's like an old god in that way. Like that, if you look at the Greco-Roman pantheons, like those gods were children. Like they were petty. They had attitude. Like they didn't like it when people played with their toys. Like, and so there is a measure of discovery about the characters that comes. I would say I discover far more about my characters than I do about my world, because the world is the thing that I kind of use as the tapestry on which to lay everything.
Yeah, so you have much more of that developed before you start writing it.
Exactly. The world is the thing that, you know, the rules for the world define so much of what I put my characters through. So the world is the first thing that I come up with.
You can really tell they're always really strong. So you're also starting to write like a lot of different mediums. Well, I suppose not start, but how are you finding that with the adjustment from novel to graphic novel to helping with a TV show? And
yeah, I mean, it's very different. And like, what I'll say is it's going to sound qualitative, but I don't mean it qualitatively. For me personally, scripts are a lot easier, but it's not because they're qualitatively easier. It's because I'm such a neurotic word chooser with my novels. And when you're writing a novel, you're very keenly aware, at least I am, that every word I choose is the word the reader's going to read. So when I'm writing a novel, what I'm actually trying to do is write a film that is going to play in my head and in the reader's head in the exact same way.
Yeah.
Down to the color palette, the soundtrack, the atmosphere, like all of it. And because of that, every single word has this immense amount of weight to it, because, you know, there's every word is a choice. But when you're writing a script, yes, that's true for the dialogue. To an extent, it will still change. Actors will ad lib and remorph it a little bit. But like in general, a script is a living document. So what I'm doing is writing words that the viewer is never going to see. The words that I'm writing are designed for my director and my showrunner and my, you know, directors of photography, like everyone that is going to touch the script and then pull pieces out of it and create their own vision. So that sense of collaboration means that for me, it feels a little bit less fraught. My novel writing process is, anyone who follows me on the internet knows this, extremely fraught with self-loathing and self-doubt. And like every time I sit down at my computer, my first enemy is myself. But when I write scripts, I think I have a little bit of an easier time getting out of my own way.
Yeah. Do you think is that anything to do with how like collaborative like TV in comparison? Yeah. There's like more people around you.
It's the same with comics. I mean, I'm creating a blueprint for my comic artist who's then going to interpret. And then much like comics, like if you have a lot of trust in your team, if you have really good team, and like the First Kill team is incredible, you know that they're going to be able to do their best work if they have a little bit of space to do that, if you're not micromanaging or dictating exactly what something is. And so the script really does become this like hugely collaborative document that everyone is looking at and using to inspire their own hand in the work.
I know like in the beginning, obviously everyone has like dreams of like doing like different mediums and like going to TV and things like that. But was there everything that you like wrote before then, or have you always like wrote novels and it's just kind of developed as your career's developed as well?
I've always been in the novel space, but I will say that my writing style, I think, is fairly cinematic. And I think, you know, that discussion of me trying to write a film that you see in your head, I think because I write with that intentionality, it lends itself to adaptation, because like I'm thinking, I'm seeing everything in my head, and I try to write in ways that you see everything in your head. And so I do think there's a sense that it's probably easier for a studio or a script writer or that team to envision, because I've designed it purposefully to that.
Yeah.
And so I definitely feel very aware of the adaptability of my work when I'm working on the novels.
So you, I suppose as well, because it's Addie that's been taken for a film. Is that how are you going to find like letting those characters not go, but kind of like?
Well, so I wrote the script for Addie, and I specifically wrote the script for Addie for that reason, because I felt like most of my projects are in some stage of development, some public and some not, but like, but I would never write those scripts. And I think it's because there's a really careful balance you have to have where like we as novelists are very close to our work, but what makes the best book doesn't necessarily make the best movie. And sometimes it's hard to take a step back and say, and make the changes that need to be made to convey the spirit of the work without the details of it. And Addie was really the only book where I was not willing to let go in that way, where I was, even if like, obviously I wrote the first version of the script and there are several iterations. So like a director will come on and they will have a version of the script. We might bring on a second screenwriter and they will have it, like, but I needed to know that I made the bones. Because I knew these characters so well from living with them for 10 years. And it was felt in the studio, felt the same, that like nobody was going to be able to articulate the skeleton down into that format. So, but I mean, I look at like all of my other projects have been optioned or an adaptation, and I haven't written any of those scripts. And so it's really cool to see how different people interpret. And I would say that like, yes, it's hard to loosen your grip a little bit, but it's deeply satisfying to see other people's visions for your work.
Yeah. And I suppose kind of in an opposite way, you're going back to the Shades of Magic world.
Yeah.
How is it going back to like having those characters again after they've been with readers for so long?
Terrifying. Okay, no, for my, like, so this is where I think having a separation between writer and author comes in. As a writer, I love it. Like, I've missed Cal and Lila. I've missed Ryan Alucard. Like, I like working on their scenes. I know them so well, but I know exactly what their banter is going to be. Like, I know it's just this first scene where we come back to Cal and Lila, it just brings me like a huge amount of joy because like I've missed them too. But like my neuroses kick in as an author. And I just think like the thing that I fear most, and I'm working on it. I know that you can't please everybody. I know that there's no such thing as a book for everybody. I have experienced that 20 times now. I have made peace with that, but I still have this fear of saying her last book was better. Like it gives me like a full body chill, right? And I think that one of the ways that I avoid that mental trap is by making all of my books very different. So I don't want you to be able to compare. Like it's difficult to compare Addie, LaRue and Vicious. Like it's difficult. I don't want you to try and have an oranges to oranges or apples to apples experience with that. So, but then when you re-step into your own world, there's a risk of people being like, Shades of Magic was better. But, and for some people it will be. And for some people Threads will be better. It will explore different things. I have grown as a human, as an author, like but I'm never interested in stretching in the same ways. So my thing about Threads of Power is I was like, I'm not repeating Shades of Magic. Like we have to come up with new ways to tell this story. Like the story that I want to tell, I don't want it to be structured the same. I don't want it to feel the same. There have to be new characters. And in that sense, like there will be people who preferred Shades of Magic more because it was Shades of Magic. But hopefully people really love Threads of Power. And this is what you can tell I'm rambling about this because I get really stressed out as I sit down to work on it, that like, it's not that people will be disappointed in some way. And I know people will be disappointed. That is the nature of readership. And all I can do is write the story that I want to write to the best of my abilities. But it's scary.
Yeah. I know with like, I mean, I would hope most readers would just be happy to get like more content for the characters that they love.
I hope so. It's so nerve-wracking. It's so nerve-wracking. But I just, Shades of Magic is already starting to exist in multiple forms. Like there's a comic, the film is in the works. I'm so excited for us to announce our director. Like it's making its slow progress through the world. And people are still discovering it. Like it's easy to think that Shades of Magic was like 10 years ago. It wasn't. It was like 5 years ago. Yeah. It just had its 6th anniversary for the first book. So like it's still quite young, and it's still, Addie has brought a whole new group to the audience. Like Addie has brought a whole new generation of readers to my stuff. So I'm just trying to, maybe by the time it comes out, I'll make peace with it. I obviously haven't made peace with it yet because it's just in broken pieces on my computer.
Yeah. Did you always intend to write a sequel, like kind of trilogy, or is that something that just kind of developed after you'd finished it?
I got halfway through Conjuring of Light and I knew that I had to write another like I knew that I could close things I wanted to close, but that there was a lot that I wanted to open.
Yeah.
So I would say it was probably 100 pages into Conjuring of Light when I called my editor and I was like, hey, I think I need more books. And she was like, well, do you want like one more book? Like, do you want it to be a 4-book series? And I was like, no. Like, I'm very excited for the closure of Conjuring of Light, but I think I need to come back.
Yeah.
And of course, and my editor was like, great, excellent. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so excited that you actually want me to do this. So I would say that I knew, obviously I knew before the first series was done. And I knew before reception had come in on the first series. I think it's easy to think like, oh, the books were successful, so she's writing more of them. But I truly, given my neuroses, would very much like to like just write new things. So I'm coming back to it because I felt like I had a story I was excited to tell.
That's cool. Because like, especially like I find with fantasy, there is quite a lot of authors that have like series in the same world, and it's always just really nice to return to somewhere that's like really familiar as a reader. No,
and I didn't want to do like a full, like I know Sanderson jumps like full generations, and I was like, I don't want to jump full generations. So it's 7 years. So everyone who survived Conjuring of Light is a main character in Threads of Power. It's just because they all were fairly young at the beginning, so they went from like 22 to 29, right? They're not that old. It's just enough time for some changes to have been made in the world around them.
So did that mean that your usual, like, you know who they are at the end and then work your way towards them changed a little bit because you kind of already know who they are, but you've got this 7-year jump?
I know. Well, now I have to figure out, I mean, that's the thing about life, right? Is we keep growing. So now I have to figure out who they are at the end of the next. I knew who they were at the end of Conjuring of Light, but obviously their narrative continues. And so now it becomes figuring out who I want them to be at the end of Threads of Power.
Yeah. So is there like an idea of who they are after at the beginning instead? Or
I have both. No. I still like before. So before I committed to writing Threads of Power, I had to know the ending again.
Yeah.
So I know the ending for each book in the trilogy.
Yeah.
And then I know who they are at the beginnings.
Yeah. You've also, like, I noticed with the ending of your books, especially even in the sequels, there's always like an opening for like more, but there's not like a cliffhanger, except obviously with like Gathering of
Shadows.
So is that like a conscious decision? Is that just something you like to do narratively?
Well, here's the thing is like, I try to make my characters feel as human as possible. I want them to feel like people. And the thing about people is that their life goes on. I think it's deeply, I don't believe in like closed loop endings. Like, I don't think stories should end that way because lives don't end that way. And I also think it helps as a reader, something I enjoy as a reader, because it makes it's a reminder that like, it's not the end. Like, I like you to put down a book and think that the characters keep going.
Yeah.
They keep living their lives. You're just not privy to it anymore. Because I always think it's like some people write a house and they let you into the house and they let you explore the entire house. And like, that's like Tolkien style, right? If you see, you can find the extent of the world. But I've always felt like I write a window. Like, I don't let you into the house. I let you look through the window of it. And I feel like the end of a series or a book for me is closing the window. But like, you know that people are still inside the house.
Yeah. I really like that analogy. What part of the whole process can you give a favorite? Because obviously there's quite a lot that's a bit like, that's a bit fraught, but
so my favorite is I have two favorites. It's the brainstorming at the very beginning, and it's the last polish at the very end.
Yeah.
Because for me, the joy is in executing an idea. And so the germination of the idea, like just rambling out onto paper, everything that it could be, it feels like this explosion of roots and weeds and nature that's just like going through my head. And I love that because it's just the idea generating part. And then I hate everything up until I'm putting my final polish on my words. And it's a comparison moment of like, did I accomplish the thing that I set out to do.
Yeah.
Everything in between is fraught, but those 2 moments, deeply exciting.
So, is there anything you're actually allowed to tell us about Gallant that you haven't?
I mean, probably not. So it comes out March 1st,
Yeah.
so I can say that. Like I say, it's like The Secret Garden meets Crimson Peak.
Mm-hmm.
It's a standalone, entirely just one book capsule. It's interesting. People keep asking, like, is it middle grade YA or adult? And I always say yes, because I think it exists in a little bit amorphously the way you would think of like a Diana Wynne Jones book or like a Neil Gaiman book, where even if they have like a young protagonist, it doesn't necessarily feel. And it's hard because my protagonist is 14, so they're a young adult, but it's not really a coming of age story, which is something that usually comes with YA.
Mm.
And it's not really it's more like a middle grade, but it doesn't feel like the point is, I don't know what kind of book it is. I still haven't figured it out. I'm very deeply proud of it. I'm very excited for readers to see it. It is so dark, but I love that about it. And what I'll say is that Gallant is the name of a house. So Gallant is the name of an estate that the character goes to. And that's all I'll say, because everything else will get me in trouble. Literally. Oh, and there are illustrations.
Oh, I love illustrations in books.
Yeah. There are the most incredible illustrations in the book. So I'm hoping the book will really feel like a very special artifact. Like, oops, I'm dropping. The book will hopefully be itself a little piece of art.
Yeah. Cool. I would say though, in terms of like defining it by genre, that's always hard anyway, but I would especially like Shades of Magic kind of like jumps across it. It doesn't really have like an age range to it. And is that intentional, or is it just like I'm writing what I want, so it's how it happens?
Yeah, I just write what I want and hope that there'll be like a place on the shelf. And I think, look, that's a huge privilege of where I'm at in my career right now. Like if Gallant had been my debut novel, I think it would be a lot bigger of a problem to like find a place, like do the thing. But I remember having this discussion with my editor, and I was like, hey, I'm really nervous because I don't know where Gallant is going to fit on the shelf. And she basically said, we're not worried. Like it's a you book. We will find a space for it. And like the thing is, that is not the answer I would have gotten at the beginning of my career. So like I'm very deeply aware that it's a huge position of privilege to even be able to say, I write what I want to write and hope people will read. Like that's not a normal thing in publishing. You know that as like a buyer, like it's hard. Everything has to fit somewhere. And so I'm really grateful that I got to do this book far enough into my career that people are being flexible in terms of what it is, what shape it is, how they'll sell it, stuff like that.
I really like that. It is really hard to like pop books in a certain section, and sometimes you just like the rest of their books are over there, so they'll just like that's where
I end up all over the store. And sometimes I like don't understand why, because like books that are published as adult in the UK or published as YA in US, like books that are published as middle grade in the US end up on the YA shelves for me in the UK. Like nobody can ever find my books, or maybe they find my books a little bit of everywhere. I kind of think of myself as like breadcrumbs scattered through the store.
Well, if anybody ever has any problems, that's what booksellers are for. They'll tell you. They'll just be like,
please use your booksellers.
So like this is probably a really cliched question, but like, are you ever, when you're like getting a new idea for a book, does it come from like a specific place, or is it always like just like from randomly?
No, it's not cliched. You know, a lot of people will ask like, where did you get your idea? As if an idea is a single thing. And for me, like maybe for some people it is, but for me, I always, to go back to my cooking metaphor, my stove metaphor, like it's many ingredients. It's many, many ingredients that come together at some point to combine into a book. And so I'm collecting those ingredients over years. That's one of the reasons my stories take so long. I never sit down and think, what if XYZ? There we go. It's like I can look at a book that I've written and see, like with Addie LaRue, At the time, I had just finished studying Peter Pan in college, which is a deeply sad story. If anyone reads it, at the end of the book, he is sitting on a rock forgetting the entire story.
Yeah.
My grandmother was dying of dementia and was forgetting my mother, and my mother was conversely being forgotten. I had a fascination with Faustian bargains, but I was really curious about the way that a woman would move through a Faustian bargain with the lack of autonomy through history. Was about to get a graduate degree in art history, and I was fascinated by the idea of the muse and what informs a work of art. As I was working on it, I moved to New York City the same year that Addie is in New York City. So all of these pieces came together to form Addie's story, but they didn't come together at one time. I would get a piece, I would put it away. I would get another piece, I would put it away. I would get a piece that turned out to be for a different book. I would like test it and be like, that's not right for this book. Let's put it away. So for me, ideas are very much like a slow gathering of things that at some point you find the cohesive ingredient, the ingredient that's going to bring it together from a collection of fragments into a meal.
That makes sense. Rather than it just like coming from one place, like.
Well, I think if it did, it would be pretty thin.
Yeah.
Like I imagine like that thing, which is the cohesive element, like the Faustian bargain. Sure, but if I had sat down and started writing then, I would have missed out on a huge number of layers for Addie. So one of the reasons that I don't write quickly, one of the reasons I don't start writing a book as soon as I have the idea is by letting it sit, I'm not only testing to see whether I want to write a book about it, but I'm making sure that it has the depth that I want. Does it work on multiple levels and layers? Am I talking about multiple things? Like I don't want to write the thinnest, most superficial version of the story. And that's what I would be left with, inevitably, because I wouldn't have had time to let everything seep down through the layers.
Yeah. You're also like an avid reader as well, obviously. But like, do you think that's quite important to like writers just to keep reading as well, to like consume content, not just like create it?
Oh, my biggest pet peeve is when writers tell me they don't have time to read, because to me, you should consider it a part of your job. It is a part of your job, because the best education you can get, the best way of improving your craft, the best way of understanding what's around you. Like I can tell when I'm reading something if the writer doesn't read. Yeah. And I can also tell if the writer only reads the kind of work they write, because you end up on an ever narrowing street. It becomes very derivative. They're not being inspired by, like I read poetry, nonfiction, historical biography, like fantasy. Like you should read things that you know you love, and you should read things that you think you won't, and everything in between. And it's because you never know what's going to make something click inside your head, what's going to put two pieces of your own story together or make you realize that you've gone down the wrong road. I think that reading is like, forget degrees, forget, all of the other things you can do to better yourself or make yourself quote unquote more qualified. Just read as much as possible. 5 years ago, I set myself a goal to read 100 books a year. Some of those are poetry, so they're small. Some of them are comics, so they're small. Some of them are like Donna Tartt, so they're big. But my quality and craft and ability improved exponentially, I believe, when I set that goal for myself. And I would say that like it is very easy for reading to be the thing that we cut from our schedule when we have deadlines, when we have day jobs, when we have everything else. You can't though. You have to treat it like as important as the time you spend writing.
Yeah. Did you manage to read 100 books in a year? Because I work with books for a living and I can't read 100 books in a year.
I think I'm going to make it to about 125 this year, but usually it's somewhere between 100 and 110.
That's insane.
I want to point out, I've held that while I have worked on a TV show and written a novel and done other things. And so to say like, I know I don't have children and I don't have a day job. This is my, like, I totally understand that. You don't have to read 100 books a year. If you set a goal of reading 20 books a year, you will still, if you make sure that not all 20 of them are in the same genre, not all 20 of them sit beside each other on the shelf. Like if you're however many books you're going to read, make sure that they are spread across the spectrum of content and style, because that's really what you're trying to do, is like get an understanding of the way other people tell story.
I really like that. But that's just because I like to read. So
Yeah,
make everybody else do it. Yeah, so I am actually out of questions. Well, probably not.
Wonderful.
So it was really nice to talk to you and to hear about your process and everything. It's been really interesting and also really helpful. May have made notes myself. But thank you for joining us for this.
Thank you so much for having me. What a blast.
Good.